and welcome to the Toronto International Virtual Boat Show seminar series sponsored by On the Water Designs, providing award-winning docks and marine systems across Ontario. Thank you for joining us. The seminar will begin in one moment. If you're having any technical difficulties, you can reach me, the online moderator, via the chat feature at the bottom of your screen. And questions for the speaker can be added in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. I will ask questions at the end of the presentation, but if you have any that come up during the session, please enter them and we can get them answered as well. And it is our pleasure to present this session, Rigging 101, What to Look For, presented by Diane Reid.
Well, hello there, everyone, and how are you today would be what I would normally say. Interesting enough, actually, I have a question to start us off. I guess I don't get to see anybody's lovely faces, do I? Yeah, okay, well, that's fine then. Welcome to you all and welcome to our conversation about rigging today. I am live from the rigging shop. So if you hear any little bits of noise in the background, it's just because we've got actual customers coming and going as we're doing this. So it's kind of interesting. The agenda for today, which may be a little different or maybe spot on for what you're after. So if it's not, make sure you throw a Q&A in there. We're going to talk about rigging, but specifically we're going to talk about masts. We're going to talk about standing and running rigging and terminations. And we're going to really focus on what would you be looking for on your mast for your boat at the end of the season, to see if you've got anything that maybe needs addressing, you know, and it may be that you can address it yourself, or it may be that you need to get someone else's expert opinion on it. But this seminar is intended to give you a little flavor for what to look for. As a brief background, I've been arguably doing rigging since the day I started sailing, because if you can't keep your mast up, you can't go sailing. And so my whole life has been sailing, and sailing on boats that range anywhere from just under 80 feet down to tiny little dinghies. And these days I get to spend a portion of my time here at the rigging shop doing rigging, building standing rigging and building running rigging for fine folk like you. So hopefully we can get to some of the topics that you're hoping to hear about today and talk about. We do have a moderator in the background, and so if there's a question or something that is pertinent and you're not getting an answer, then you know, you're welcome to try and engage in any way that you can so that we can talk about it. And in fact, I can see that there's already a question in there about rod rigging. So I'm going to come to a portion on rod rigging, and I'll try to remember to speak to that when we get there. Let me start off by talking about what you would look for in your standing rigging and in your mast at the end of the season before you pack it away for the winter. And I like to talk about this in the context of top to bottom. So when you're looking at your mast, get my little picture up there. When you're looking at the mast, we're going to start at the top of it. And this is a really good practice to do every time you unstep your mast. Not everybody pulls their mast down every year. Sometimes they do it periodically. Start at the top of the mast. And what you can see in the picture here is a very typical mast crane. And masthead. And you can see on the left-hand side of the screen, there's what we call a crane there. It's the silver looped, let me see if I can get my little cursor over it here. It's the silver looped portion here. So if your boat has a spinnaker, you might have a spinnaker crane, which helps to hold your halyard out there. One of the reasons I like to mention this is because there's a lot of load that ends up on this halyard pulling, you know, from the outboard edge, almost like a teeter-totter, imagine it, pulling on it. So when you're looking at your mast in terms of, you know, what's going on and what's good and what's bad, you always want to look at areas that might be fatigued, and that means the metal has started to move and bend. If anything is moving and bending, it's wearing out and it needs to be addressed. We also have on the top of the mast, I mean, there's just like so many things, but you can see there's a VHF antenna up here. There's lights, there's electrical, there's all sorts of things going on up here that you're going to want to look at to see if there's any wear and tear. One of the other key things that I would mention is what we call a halyard restrainer. So a halyard restrainer is this little sort of shoehorn looking thing on the front of the mast. And a halyard restrainer will suffer lots of wear. It's designed to take lots of wear. And what you want to look for, in fact, up there is if anything's starting to chafe and burn through and mark up your mast. Now, I'm just having a look at the Q&A while we're going here, so you guys will kind of bear with me. The one question I've got, and I'll come back to this one because I mentioned earlier that I have a question here that says, should you step your mast each year, as in bring it down? I will tell you as a rigger, yes, in my opinion, you need to take your mast down every year and do this inspection conversation that we're talking about. However, functionally, that's not always a reasonable expectation for some people. You might not be around, or you might, it might just be so cumbersome that it's something that you do maybe every couple of 2-3 years. So have a plan for removing your mast, for stepping your mast and giving it a thorough inspection for sure. Just looking back at the rest of the stuff on this head of the mast. So you can see when you're looking at the head of the mast, you've got lots of wire, and I've mentioned already chafe. Chafe is the killer of everything, chafe and wear and tear. So whenever you're looking at the top, at the head, look for all sorts of any spots where there's rubbing, friction, abrasion, anything like that. And you know, worst case scenario, if you're not sure, take a picture and bring it in somewhere and have it looked at, whether you were to bring it here or just show it to a friend. Take a picture and have it looked at. There's another question here, which is actually quite relevant to the moment. The question is, do we suggest painting an aluminum spar? And I can't tell you about which paint to use, but what I will tell you is, certainly if you're going to paint it, there are lots of painted masts out there. The one in the picture looks like it's been painted white. If you're going to paint your mast, the thing to keep in mind there is it will give you the opportunity to look for corrosion because paint will start to lift. So if you're looking at a painted mast, then definitely look for any bits of corrosion and bubbling. So that's where the moisture gets in and it starts to bubble the paint up. And you'll see, if you were to take a knife or a screwdriver and scrape it off, you'll see some corrosion underneath it. So that sometimes is the downside to painting your mast, is that it can inhibit the air drying out the surface, and it can cause or encourage, maybe the right word is, it can encourage corrosion. That also, though, is the other thing to be looking for. So if you're looking at this masthead, you can see there's 3 different types of metal up there. Even if you just go by color, there's 3 different types of metal. There's aluminum, there's stainless steel, there's a cast piece on the very top. Every time you have different metals, dissimilar metals, you're encouraging corrosion. So it's something to look for, and it's something that's easy to clean up. It's not a hazardous material or anything like that, but it's something that you want to keep on top of for sure. Let's keep looking down here. So the other bullet point says the toggle at the forestay. So what does that mean? Well, hang on, I got 2 screens I'm doing here so I can point to things for you guys. When you're looking at your halyards, and when you're looking at any of your attachment points for your standing rigging, so the wire or the rod, anything that connects into the mast, you also want to look at, and we're gonna look at some more of this in a bit more detail, but you want to look where 2 bits of metal come together and if anything's starting to bend and flex out of position. This is another great shot of what to look for. And this is a bit more of an electrical conversation, looking at the top here. I would always recommend, when you're taking your rig apart, remove the anemometer. The anemometer is the wind reading instrument at the top here. This wand, if you've got to buy a new one, it's like $600. So anytime you get a chance to remove any of this, these bits and pieces of equipment so that they don't get damaged in winter storage, then absolutely do that. Bag up the fitting on the end. If you've, in this picture here, sometimes there's a little cap hanging off to the side, and I'll bet you the cap disappeared a long time ago. So cover things up so that the electrical components don't get damaged with water. I would take your VHF antenna off as well, so that it doesn't get bent or broken. And have a look then. If you guys look at the screen, you can see just over here, this little pile of electrical. It could be bent, it could be damaged. When wiring ages, especially when it's exposed to UVs, it gets very brittle, and even just getting touched, it might break. So be careful with your stuff when you're looking at it. If you don't want to replace it, don't wiggle things too much, because you might be working fine, so leave it be, but definitely visually give it an inspection and see if it looks like it's aging out. The last thing you need is, during the summer coming, you're out there sailing and all of a sudden your lights don't work or a component fails, and it's because the wiring was at the end of its life, and you really want to capitalize on the opportunity to replace that wiring when the mast is down during the winter. Lots and lots of things to look up at, and there's even all sorts of stuff internally. So internally, if we were looking at our masthead, there are sheaves inside there, which is what your halyards and everything roll around, of course. So look at your sheaves, look at the pins that they rotate on, look at all of these different connection points and see if you see wear and tear. The beautiful thing here is my ability to just look at stuff for wear and tear is going to work. You're going to look at it and you're like, well, that doesn't look quite right, and that's exactly what needs to spark in your mind. And that's what's going to start to encourage you to ask more questions to see if something needs to be managed or replaced or taken care of. There are so many, you can see the little bullets here, but there are so many little aspects that you could be looking at, but really it summarizes into anything that doesn't look like it should be like that. Just having a little look at, there's another question here about mass and wax. I will tell you that there are all sorts of things that you can use to polish your mast if you want to keep it bright and shiny. The one year I actually polished my mast, it was so shiny you'd look up and it was actually kind of hard on the eyes. But I would definitely recommend cleaning your mast. I would definitely recommend cleaning it up so that any wear marks get polished out, so that each year you can see fresh abrasion. If there's any abrasion at all, you can see fresh stuff. Whether you use a wax or you use a cleaner or you use an aluminum polish to do that, the options are endless, certainly in terms of what you can be looking for. Let's have a little chat about sheaves, and I've actually got one here. So this is the big testing moment. We're going to see if, so I'm looking at me on my screen, but I'm going to show you guys this. I'm going to ask the group, can someone put in the chat if you can see inside the sheav enough? Is this worth doing? I'll just give you a second. One person, just tell me if you can see it or not.
Yeah, we have a few people saying yes.
You can see it? Awesome. Thank you very much. So sheaves are, well, they're a mission critical conversation. Sheaves can be made out of Delrin, plastic. This one's aluminum. So what you want to look for when you're looking at sheaves, just similar to what's on the picture there, but you want to look for any of this metal starting to wear out and chafe. This sheave used to be for a halyard that years ago was wire and then had a splice in it and it went to rope. And so the amount of wear in here is massive. And a lot of times people will swap. They'll need a new halyard, so they'll get rid of the old wire stuff and they'll move to just a regular blended line rather than having a wire blend in there. And what you want to watch for now is where there was all sorts of little chunks and pieces bitten out of here before, it's going to start to damage your halyard. You also want to look at the hole here to make sure that it hasn't egged and opened up and causing warble. I had a customer in here the other day who said, you know, the Shiv looked fine, but right beside it was actually really badly damaged, and it's because the shiv was doing this in the shiv box. So have a look at your shivs, have a look at the surrounding area, and see if you can see any wear and tear. The ones in the picture here in the slide deck are kind of no-brainers, aren't they? I mean, you're looking at that and you're like, that just looks so bad. But what I would encourage you to think about, if you look at the one on the left-hand side, there's like a, what I would call a burn. So that's where the line has continued to rub and chafe, and it's actually digging a groove in the plastic in the Delrin. There's a reason for that. And so what you also want to do is you want to look kind of around the area and see if there's something causing it. Because even if you fix this shiv, it might happen again because you haven't actually fixed the problem. You just kind of put a Band-Aid on the solution. So always look, whenever you're inspecting, look at the shivs, pull them out if you can, but look around them as well and see if there's anything that's causing any specific reason for the damage. Working our way from the top down in this conversation, we are going to start to look at the track. And in this picture here, the mast is up. But if you've got it out on sawhorses, fantastic. If it's not on sawhorses and you've got to put someone up the mast, I mean, it can still be done, but it's not as easy to do. So coming down the mast track, you want to look for alignment to start with, especially if you were hoisting your mainsail during the summer and it would get caught part way up. You want to look and see if maybe one of the sections of the mast has come loose. In this picture here, there's, you know, a screwdriver in, just whether it's tightening up or removing a screw, but sometimes be it the rivets or the screws start to come loose, and that might be causing your track alignment problem and your hoist problems. The other thing that you want to look for is wear up either side of the track. So just on either side here, I actually had a marine surveyor give me a call the other day and said, you know, I'm looking at this mast and it's like skid marks going up the side. What do you think that is? Is it something we need to be worried about? And I said, you know, it's quite likely that as the sail is hoisting, the batten cars are dragging up the side of the mast as it's going up. Nothing that we can change other than make sure the boat is head to wind better on the hoist, but it's definitely causing damage. So lots of things to be looking at. So always look for scratches, look for alignment, certainly any bends in the tracks, and definitely any screws that are sticking out. Now just give me 1 second here. I'm going to click on the chat and see. Just having a little look here. So we're talking about rigging. There's a conversation, or there's a comment in there about B&R rigging in the chat. The question is, you know, do we know much about B&R rigging? B&R rigging, for everybody else's education, is typically what you would see on a hunter. And B&R rigging is where you've got, I'll call it reversed verticals, and there's lots of riggy bits in there that are very complicated for managing. But in terms of maintenance, B&R rig is the exact same conversation as what we're talking about now. In terms of tuning the rig, that is a totally different conversation. All right. The other thing that you need to look for in your rig, and this actually is best checked before you bring the mast down. When your mast is still up, have a look at it. Now you guys are probably looking at this slide and you're like, you might be saying, oh, there's nothing wrong with that. Why has she put that up there? But look carefully. This rig, the spreaders are actually slightly bent. So they're kind of, I'll be overly dramatic here, but they're kind of twisted like that. And then also, if you look at it's called a marina. If you look at where the intermediate stay comes up and terminates at the mast, you can actually see that it's slightly bent at the swage. Some of these things you really want to look at before you bring the mast down as well as after, because you might not be able to see the misalignment or the odd sort of twist in things once you've undone all of your standing rigging and everything kind of goes slack. So definitely look for things while it's up, and the symmetry being out of whack. And here's the fun part. Uncover everything. Uncover in the picture here, you can see the spreader boots. Spreader boots are the white caps that stop the chafe on your sail, on your head sail. Every time you tack back and forth. And if you've got a 100% jib, if you've got a small one, you probably don't have any real issues with chafe, but nevertheless, pull these spreader boots off. I have gone and looked at masts that when I take a knife to the tape holding it on, it cracks and it's brittle and it falls apart, and sometimes even the little boots fall apart. And in this picture here, you can see that is corrosion. That is a huge level of corrosion. That should not happen. The problem with the corrosion is it eats away at the aluminum or at whichever metal it is and fatigues it. And this, in this case, this is holding the mast up. This has your cap shroud or whichever shroud in there. And if it's wearing away and letting go, it's going to be gone. I had a customer who I walked past their boat one day and I actually could see the shroud had popped out because the fitting had gotten so corroded that it completely failed and the shroud popped out. And I actually called him up and I said, you need to look up before you go sailing because your mast isn't going to stay up. And he got it sorted out and fixed. But this is just a great example of remove and inspect. Cut things off, take pictures before you do so you know how to put it back together again, but remove and inspect. Absolutely. Let me just take a quick run through on the questions and stuff like that here. If you throw, just so you guys know, if you throw something in the chat and it kind of gets missed, feel free to put it back in there. We'll try to keep an eye on things as we go. It's just a little interesting and tricky to do that. The other question that I saw, hang on one second. Hi, Michael Egbert, so you're on the call. The question is there a good checklist? I think we're kind of making a checklist here, but in terms of what to look for, start at the top and look at everything as you go down, all right? Let me just slide this over. All right, these are your spreader roots, or they could also be called the hounds, sorry, not the tangs. They are sometimes, and you can see in the top picture, the spreader root there is riveted on. Not my favorite, but it is a very common way to do things. If you have a loose rivet, and just so I can float my little cursor over here. So these are the rivets here that I'm talking about, and just in case anybody isn't aware. When you're looking at rivets, you want to see that everything is tightly fitting. If the head of the rivet, that little sort of shoulder on it, is starting to lift and bend a little bit, it needs to go and a new rivet put in. If you are doing that yourself, do not just go with soft aluminum rivets. Go with the strongest thing you can find, to be blunt, which would be, you can get stainless steel rivets, and that's what I would recommend, particularly when it comes to spreaders. Or if you want to get super crazy fancy, you can get Manel, but Manel is really hard to find. But definitely looking at where your spreaders install, you want to look for any fatigue, wearing, that same conversation, the hole starting to get wobbly. And in the case of the picture on the bottom of the screen, this is a welded piece instead of a fastened piece. You need to look at the welds, and this is a lovely example here. These welds look fine, so I would not, say you need to know what welding is all about, but all you need to look for is a crack, a break, or the pieces out of alignment. I was putting the mast up on a boat, this is a couple of years ago now, and we'd put the spreaders out the day before. We came back the next day to put the mast up, and what was like this was now like this. And when we took the spreader off, we could see at that point that right in here at the base, in fact, one of the welds had failed. Probably somebody walked into it by accident, and I mean aggressively, like backed a truck into it kind of thing. But it had failed. The weld had failed. So very important to look at however your spreaders are attached to the boat, because if it fails, you might be looking at this. this is just a fun picture of how many things could be wrong with your spreader. So definitely be giving them a look for sure. And just scrolling through the pictures here, the questions here. One of the things that I mentioned earlier on was the fittings, the terminals, the terminations. And I kind of mentioned it briefly and then I stopped. And it's because I wanted to spend a little more time on it here, be it at the top of the mast or even at deck level or anywhere in between. Anytime in your standing rigging, and you can see the pictures there again with the ever so slightly twisted spreaders and the intermediate shroud sitting there kind of sticking up a little bit. Anytime you have standing rigging, and I'll speak specifically to 1x19, so wire rather than rod rigging. Anytime you have that, you have what are called swaged terminations. And a swaged termination, I like the picture here. Let me move this over so I can point to it. There we go. So all of these little pieces here, I'm going to go back to the other slide in a second. These are what we call swaged terminations. So going back, so if you look at this intermediate here, you can see that there's like what looks like a fitting on the end and then the wire going into it. What you need to look for in this stuff, and we get a lot of stuff that comes into the shop here where it's bent, but look at the angle. So this should be nice and straight like the dash line, but you can see that the wire is actually bent down, and this is after it's undone. So in its sort of natural lying state, it's bent. The way these things go together, let me move forward just 2 little spots. They go through a press. We squeeze them, literally squeeze them in a press, and it crushes, by design, it crushes the outer sleeve in around the wire, but it needs to stay in its elongation. It needs to stay in alignment. If it doesn't, what happens is it starts to bend and break the stranded wires going inside, not inside, but going inside. So literally right at this junction where it switches from where you can see the stranded wire up to the swage piece. So when you're looking at your standing rigging, you need to look for metal that is bent or swaged terminations where the alignment is no longer in a straight line. The other thing you need to look for is cracks. So this is that same fitting, the exact same fitting, but a real live picture where it comes up in, this is actually a forestay and this is a furling forestay, but you want to look for cracks. So this crack is micro in its size, and it might even just look like a little bit of rust. So if you're not sure what you're looking at, go to your kitchen sink, get a little green scrubby pad and some soap and water and just give it a good scrub and see if when you clean off the rust, if you can see that tiny little hairline fracture. Here at the shop, we do visual inspections on all this stuff. If we needed to, we could spray a little blue dye in there and kind of see if it traces in and falls into that tiny hairline crack. But if you can see a crack, it needs to be replaced. As soon as the metal has fatigued to the point where you can see a crack, it is done. It's toast, it's out of there. So that is definitely something you want to have replaced, because the last thing you need, I mean, this whole conversation is ultimately about making sure that when you go sailing next time, your rig doesn't fall down or you don't have some kind of catastrophic failure that just ruins your summer. So look for cracks, look for tiny little hairline cracks. You saw this a second ago, but I'll let you actually look at it in greater detail now. This is just some examples of what these swage terminations look like. They're all different shapes and sizes, all different mechanisms of connecting to your mast, lots and lots of different ways, but just so you can appreciate, these are the pieces you need to be looking at when it comes to bent fittings and stuff. Then there's this. Now, if anybody in the group has a very tiny boat, like a day sailor, like a CL14 or a little dinghy or something like that, your mast might be held up with this kind of setup. Anybody who's in this little seminar who has a bigger boat that has their, as part of their standing rigging holding their mast up, has any of these kind of connections, needs to replace them immediately. So this, it's a bit of a hand-drawn picture, but this little guy right here, this is the wire, and it has been bent around a thimble. And then that's a copper sleeve. They're not all copper these days. So if you're looking for this, it won't necessarily be that sort of brownish oxidized looking color. But if you have rigging that's holding up your mast that looks like this, that's not what this is for. This kind of setup, it's great for dinghies, for little tiny dinghies. It's fine for that. But this is literally, we squeeze this together with a micro press. It's just like a big set of vice grips. We squeeze it together. It doesn't have the holding power that the other press has. So have a look at your boat and see if you've got stuff like this. We do actually get people that come in and say, I need a new one of this. This is for my 28-foot boat, and this is the forestay. And we're like, whoa, it doesn't have the ability to hold your rig up. It does have its place though. It does have its purpose. So any super light load activities is where you would use this. Maybe, you know, if you've got some bits and pieces hanging off your stern and you need some wire to manage that, this would be the mechanism you'd use. Flag poles are a great example of what the kind of loads that you would want on these. The pregnant pause is just every once in a while I have a look to see if there's any questions that I should be speaking to that I'm missing. So there we go. Okay, this is my favorite. Oh, this is a conversation about turnbuckles, or now we've made it to the bottom of the mast. We're down in the lower section. So you can see the picture on the lower left. This is where the turnbuckle and the rest of your standing rigging connects to the chain plate at your deck level. When you're looking for wear and tear and damage, you want to look for, the word can be galling or marring. That's the word that we use. But basically what you're looking at is any of the threads, if they have flat spots on it. And a really obvious indication that there's a problem is if you're trying to unscrew the barrel, the body here, and they don't go so far and then it gets stuck. It could just be because of dirt. On the right-hand side picture, you can see there's a lot of dirt and just crapola in there. So you might get your toothbrush out, not the one you use every day, but the one that's in your toolbox, and give that a little scrub and get rid of all the junk that's in there. But if you can actually see where the threads are starting to flatten over, or as extreme in the lower left, then it's time to replace, because if you can't undo it, you can't adjust things, fix things, change things. You can't tune your rigging properly. So you need to replace it so that you've got all the versatility and the flexibility that you need in your rig. The other thing to look for, which really isn't in this picture, but I'm going to mention it. Let me just, oops, sorry. Stand by. There we go. So if you're looking at the split ring inside the turnbuckle, that's what I want you all to look at. If you see that that split ring is stationary and doing its job, that's fine. But if it looks like it's been twisted over, it means that when the rig went up in the spring, somebody turned the top section without isolating it. And what you will probably find as you undo it is the whole thing is going to start to spin on you quite quickly. If that's happened, the real concern is that you've actually started to open up the wires in the stranded wire, and you've caused some internal damage to the wire itself. So it's really good to look at your, and it could be a pin as opposed to a ring, but look at your pins and rings and look at them to see if it looks like the body of the barrel has been trying to rotate around, and pay attention to that. And then have a look at the rest of your rig, the standing rigging, run your fingers along it and see if it feels like the wires are starting to rise up. I'll show you like the most extreme example of that is this here. And I'm fairly confident you can all see it. Here, I'll put it in front of my shirt so you can see it. But this is what this wire looks like if it's been unspun. So there's a center core here. And then there's the outer section. Now this is actually from a forestay, and it was on a furling system, and it actually got caught, and it did what we call a bird cage and opened up. But this is the extreme end of what you'll end up with if that starts to happen. So feel first to see if any of the wires are starting to rise up and become a little proud. That's a concern. It's something you would keep an eye on for sure. The other thing you're going to look for in the turnbuckles is cracks, just like everything else we've been talking about. I've had turnbuckle bodies come into the shop, and they literally, where the threads go through, the whole side is sort of parted off. And first thing we'll say is everybody okay? Did the rig fall down? Because the whole system has failed. And usually you can prevent that by looking for those tiny little hairline cracks. And if you see a crack, then, you know, get that piece replaced. It's pennies to, well, I shouldn't say pennies, but it's dollars to replace, as opposed to a like mast failure and someone gets hurt, you know. So it's the nickel solution versus the catastrophic issue. So keep an eye on your turnbuckles for sure, and keep looking at them to make sure they're not starting to fail. There's a question in the comment. There's been a couple about rig inspections. I will come back to that at the end for sure. And there's another question in the chat or comment about mast steps. I'm pretty sure near the end of this deck we've got a little picture of a mast step. So we'll talk about mast steps in a minute. These are just some really good pictures of what you would be looking for. Fantastic pictures of cracks. And the other thing I want to point out to you, I think I got one more here. Yes, I do. So there's a tiny, the picture in the middle is a tiny, tiny hairline crack. But what is also happening, or could be happening, it could be cracking because water is getting in there. And we, in the cold climates here, our rigs freeze in the winter. It's just a fact. But if you've got water that's working its way down the spirals of the wires and then getting inside there, it's freezing and it's spreading, isn't it? So the other thing that we worry about and we focus on, maybe is a better conversation, is if you can see any corrosion where the swaged part meets the stranded wire. So you're looking around here, over here, this picture on the right, that black that you see is guck. It's not corrosion. Corrosion will look like rust. It'll be that reddish kind of brownish color, and it'll maybe even a bit yellowy, but it'll look like rust. So watch for that stuff. Absolutely watch for that stuff, because you don't need things, you know, breaking at the last minute. And then also look for, as bluntly said, broken strands. Do I have one? No, I thought I had a broken strand here, but I don't. Look for broken strands. And if you've got a broken strand, it's done. It's toast. It is beyond its lifespan, but look for broken strands. You get lots of, oh, there's the corrosion one. I knew I had one that had corrosion on it. And there you can actually see a broken strand as well. Now this is imminent failure. I don't know where this picture came from. I'm not familiar with this backstory on it, but this is horrible imminent failure for sure. So if your rig looks like this, get it replaced. You might even find these days that your insurer will be asking you the last time that the standing rigging was replaced, and they will, some of them are starting to subscribe to a replacement program. If you're in salt water, for example, though, so let me go back. If you're in salt water, most accepted best practice is 5 years. If you're in freshwater, often you will hear a conversation of 15 years, and it's, you know, at the end of its life. So, but if it looks like that, or if it's got any of the cracks in it, it's done. It's time to replace it. All right, little segue here from the standing rigging part of it, a little bit more about the running rigging and the moving parts. This is an excellent picture of what to look for. And I'm going to say this is another example, though, of something to look for while the mast is up. So on the left-hand side of the screen, you can see a halyard going into the mast. There should be a proper exit in there, like in the picture on the right, which manages the anti-chafe, but that's not always the case. But nevertheless, what you can see is the halyard is actually rubbing on the aluminum. So look at your gear, look at your mast when it's in its position to see if you're getting chafe points on any of the running rigging as well. And if you do have chafe points, then you might be seeing this if you look at your running rigging. The lower right-hand corner is a fantastic picture of something that has given up the ghost. It has gone beyond being herniated. And I will tell you, so this is a halyard. You can see that there's a halyard shackle on the end there. And probably what's happened with the green one on the lower right is it's been hoisted all summer long. It's a jib halyard, you know, let's just go with, and it sits there and it just kind of oscillates a little bit and does all this wear and tear. Now, the good news is I wouldn't throw that out. I would use it for something else, or maybe the other end is perfectly fine. So you might just end for end it. And so that means you need a splice, but you don't necessarily have to replace the entire bit of line. But do not hoist that. These lines require their cover and their core to give you the full aspect of their strength. And same thing with the one on the top. That's just starting to wear and tear. So maybe it's just time to end for end it. But you can see in the left-hand picture, I got to move over here just to have a little look. You can see that that is a rubbing chafe point. So part of the inspection when your mast is up is to include where your running rigging is sitting. Well, masts, winches. Some of you guys might and gals might have winches on your mast. Give them a spin. The same with all those little blocks and turning points and everywhere where running rigging runs. Give everything a spin and make sure that it moves the way it should. If it's on the slide it says clunks, backspins. Backspins would be bad. That means parts have actually failed. But give it a spin. Get your owner's manual out, take them apart, get them cleaned. If you don't want to be that person taking it apart, that's fine. You know, there's lots of people who will do it. It's like anything else, there's just a fee for it. But get them cleaned and lubricated so that they don't fail on you or you don't end up with a critical failure because of all the gunk inside there. So we had that comment about mast steps and just to, I'll read it. It says, thoughts on mast steps, like them, hate them, best ones, thanks. I don't like this mast step. This is a keel stepped mast, and that just means that the mast comes right through the deck and goes down and sits on the keel, and that's the step there that you can see. Let me put my cursor on it for you. So this kind of boxy shape around it. The short flat answer is every mast has a mast step. They don't all look like this. Sometimes they're just an internal collar that it sits into with a little bit of a plate underneath it. What you need to think about though with mast steps, and something that we get frequently here at the shop, someone might come in and say, you know, my rigging is too long. And we'll say, well, you need to look at your mast step because maybe your mast is actually moving down. So looking at your mast step is part of the conversation. Now, I realize that it is 1:45. We are almost done. So let me just kind of, this is just a few pictures of some critical failures and corrosion. These are chain plates. So look for stuff like this. Chain plates can be replaced, you know, it's not a big deal. The exact same conversation about the mast, all of that just goes over to the boom. So you're looking for all the same kind of stuff in the boom, but with a level of diligence in terms of, think about accidental jibes, and that boom comes whipping across. We get a lot of shock load on booms. And sometimes this happens. This is a picture of a piece of a fitting that's actually ripped out of the mast as a result, I think, I'm not sure on this one, but of an accidental jibe. So, or an accidental error with a spinnaker pole, because that might have been a spin pull track. If you've got rod rigging, the question earlier, the comment about rod rigging, and I apologize, if you want to come back to your rod rigging question, put it back in the list and I'll see if I can answer it in a minute or two here. But Same conversation with rod rigging. If you have rod rigging, look for craps. Move anything that's in the way of looking at the head. I say that anything because there could be all sorts of things in the way, but move stuff back so you can see the head of the rod. And that is most likely where you will see failure because that's the load point. So make sure you have a look at that. Fun stuff. All sorts of things to look at for failures in your rigging, all sorts of things to look at. This is lifelines. You know, when you're looking at lifelines, most of us have a PVC coating on our lifelines, so it traps moisture and corrosion and stuff too. So really give all of your mast, your standing, your running rigging, give it a really good eyeball. Your natural spidey senses will kick in and tell you something's wrong, but this hopefully gives you a little picture of literally of things to look for. And with that, I know we do a little Q&A session here, and I'm sure that's going to get opened up in a second. But I will just say, if in case anybody's logging off, if you guys have further questions, or if you have to go, you don't get your question in, you can always call the Rigging Shop, of course. You can email rigging at Rigging Shop, or info is what's on your screen at riggingshop.com. And there's 3 of us that are riggers here. We can answer questions for you. There's always one of us here. So with that, I will turn it over to our fantastic hostess who might help me out with some questions here.
Sure. Do you want me to start at the top of the Q&A and just work the way down?
Sure. And I'm going to pause. There was one thing in the chat. It said, will you be able to answer M. Rossi's question? And I obviously haven't seen that. So if we see that.
Sure. Yeah, it's the second one there. So it says, if time allows, kindly address the installation of an inner forestay to accommodate a stay sail. I'd like to transform my sloop into a cutter rig.
Okay, so that's the short answer as opposed to the 2-hour answer. The short answer is, if you're considering putting an inner forestay in, you need to make sure that the load points where you're going to connect can take the load. So in terms of whatever the boat is, if you can still connect with the manufacturer of the boat to make sure that that section of the foredeck can take the load, awesome. If not, I would strongly recommend getting a engineered opinion on it, because boats are not always made to take that kind of load on the foredeck. And in terms of your mast, same thing. Whoever built your mast, if it's Selden or Sparcraft or whoever made it, will absolutely be able to speak to how you can manage the loads. But lots of people do that. It's a thing. Yep.
And then the next one was, what is typical tension for rod rigging? How can you check it?
Typical tension for rod rigging. First of all, you need a rig. Oh, I should have grabbed a gauge. I didn't grab a gauge. That would have been clever for this. There's gauges that we use for measuring tension. So you need a gauge that will specifically do rod rigging versus stranded wire. And then beyond that, I would always say you're in a what we call a 10 to 15% of the load of the wire. So whatever the or the rod, whatever the load specs are on the rod. And if you're a stranded wire person, that's the same answer. Whatever the load specs are on that wire, you want to run 10 to 15% of pulling on it. The gauges actually tell you all that stuff. So you can look at the gauge size, and then the load specs are on it, which is handy.
And next, do you have suggestions for painting an aluminum spar, paint prep, and type?
And that one I kind of answered earlier on. I can't tell you which paint. I'm not particularly an expert on paint, but we have lots of other people here who would be. So I would say that would be a phone call or an email to get some unique guidance on what type of paint. So.
And next, are there universal or aftermarket mast heads to add to my small mast for additional halyards? My 2 halyards and electrical run inside. I have a Hellman 20. I need more halyards and don't trust the pulleys and would like to replace it all.
You're not going to find a head unless you happen to find someone who has an old mast that's the same and they're parting it out. But what I would recommend is, in fact, that you go with external halyards if you're adding any on. In that very first picture, there was a crane there, and so you can add cranes on. And at that point, you're talking about getting a machinist involved and somebody either welding you up something or making you something to do that. But the other option being, there's some fiberglass elements out there, like some G10 and stuff you might be able to use, but I would think about adding a crane like what was in the first picture and getting a machinist to make it for you.
And next, how much does a typical rigging inspection, how much is covered by a survey?
Right. Well, an inspection, like when we do an inspection here, it would be anywhere from an hour to 2 hours of labor plus travel. So if you get anybody else to do an inspection for you, I mean, I don't know what their hourly rates are, but that's what you'd be looking at with us. So we charge $120 an hour. I mean, we're just kind of like any other shop in that respect, and whatever extra travel is involved to do that.
And next is alternative to riveting, welding, or was the comment?
Machine screws, to answer the question, machine screws. So instead of rivets, if you want something that is a more secure mechanical fitting and one that you can disassemble and reassemble, it's a question of drilling and tapping. So whenever I install anything on someone's mast, I will always drill and tap, because I just find that rivets are easily fatigued. If anybody knows my stories of crossing the Atlantic Ocean and racing, I got knocked out of a race because of a rivet that failed, rather than, and that was the last time. I never will have rivets again in my life. But there you go. That's my answer for that.
And next, I've just bought a 10-year-old boat with a US spars mast. I had great difficulty removing the spreaders and spreader ends. Any suggestions to remove and make it easy for future years?
You could spray them with a little McLube beforehand, before you reconnect everything. So a lot of times it's an internal fitting that you're pulling out of the spreader, for example, like to get the end cap off. So you could spray that with a little McLube. It's just a very thin lubricating spray. It could also just be, it was really hard to take it apart because nobody's taken it apart in a long time. So take it apart, clean it, get that green scrubby out again, and like from your kitchen sink, give it a good cleaning, and you might find then inside and out, clean it. You might find then that it just goes back together a lot easier.
Next, it says Alberg 30 wooden spreaders, ancient but still solid. If or when need to replace, what species of wood do you recommend?
I don't have a recommendation on that. That is not my area of expertise. I have people that like it. So if you sent an email into the shop, I have someone that I would recommend you speak to. I have an expert in that area, not internally into the shop, but someone who is a shipwright and would be able to answer that. So you can send an email.
All right. And next, is there a maximum number of years before you should replace standing rigging if sailing seasonally on fresh water in Ontario?
I would roughly recommend 15 years. Rigs have stood up longer than that. Rigs have failed before that, but that's kind of a good middle ground answer. So you put your head around that and you start thinking about what you want to replace and when, and make a plan.
And do you recommend rings or pins?
I'm a big fan of rings. Some people don't like them. They prefer pins, but I like rings because they're easy to remove if you got to remove in a pinch. Pins are just a pain in the butt to get out.
And do you recommend any measures to prevent water from running down the wire into the swag?
Into the swage? No.
Swage, sorry.
No, that's fine. In fact, so you will sometimes see people will put silicone or Sikaflex or bedding compounds to try and sort of plug that up. And I think it just makes it worse, because as soon as the wire moves a little bit, it creates cracks, and now it helps to hold the moisture in. So my answer is leave it as exposed to the air as possible, so that when it gets wet, it can dry out again. And keep that in your solution bag, especially if you're taping what you should be doing, whether it's a ring or a pin, if you're taping up to create an anti-chafe, make sure the bottom of your tape has a hole for the water to run out so that you're not creating like a little trough to hold the water in there.
And if a swage fitting has a crack and needs to be replaced, is the shroud toast or can it be used again?
It's toast.
Toast.
They can't be separated. They need to be swaged in place all at once.
And is 15-year replacement of standing rigging regardless of use of boat 4 months out of 12 and dropping mast for winter?
It's your best judgment in terms of that 15-year comment. If you've hardly ever used your mast, if it's not been up and exposed and it's just been quietly tucked away, and if it's been under a shed or even inside for that matter, then no, you're going to get more of a lifespan out of it for sure. That's just a rough conversation of typical and typical for freshwater. So seasonal being, let's call it, 6 or 5 months of the year. Yeah.
And my halyard lines are hard but not chafing. Neighbor suggested I swap out for new softer lines. If no chafe occurring, should I?
Yes, I would swap out, and I'll give you the reason why. It's not just to sell you new lines, but the problem with stiff lines is if you have an emergency and you need to, if it's a halyard and you need to drop your jib right away in a hurry, and you've got, we call it fossilized. You've got fossilized lines, the sail isn't going to drop really fast, or the line isn't going to move through the sheave in an emergency. And so that would be the reason why I would say you need to swap them out. You could also maybe just end for end them. So keep that in mind, instead of replacing the entire line. End for end means literally what's at this end and what's at this end. You just rotate it around and get a new splice if you need a splice on that end. If you can give up 3 feet of the line without it becoming too short, it's possibly an option.
And what do you think about rigging tension instruments that one can buy on Amazon?
Oh, I don't care if you buy it on Amazon. Our gauge of choice here is made by a company called Loos, L-O-O-S. It's pretty common. I think every rigger I've ever seen uses Loos gauges. Our mechanical swaging is done with a Loos swager and stuff like that too. So that's a good brand. I got don't know anything about Amazon. They're just selling you stuff. So.
And I see a number of masts in the yard all wrapped up, then condensation gets trapped in there. Do you recommend leaving a stored mast wrapped or unwrapped?
Yeah, that's a very good question. In fact, if it's painted, not wrapped, because you'll hold the water in there and you'll cause lots of potential corrosion in the layers of the paint and anywhere else. If you want to, so most people wrap their mast because it keeps everything from falling over the side and getting caught on stuff. So if you wrap your mast, I would recommend, you're always thinking about air exposure. So wrap in little sections, not as a continuous, like a skid wrap, or get the saran wrap out and go all the way up. I would not recommend that because it's the same conversation. You're trapping moisture in there. If you create breaks along the way so the air can get through and it's just keeping it tidy, that would be ideal.
And what do you use, or what did you use to clean your mast? Any natural, eco-friendly options?
I'm going to say, send an email to the shop. The list of what's over there is massive and lots of eco-friendly options. I can't pick one off the top of my head other than, good sweat and scrubbing. And you might polish it as well, but again, too many options to list right now. So send an email to the shop at info.
And I have a 35-year-old blue water boat on Lake Ontario with original rigging that to date looks fine. Should I just replace regardless?
My short answer is yes. There's too much internally that you can't see that could be corroded and failing. And what might happen one day is it just, something snaps. But yeah, and I would suggest, if you mentioned to your insurer that your rig was that old, I'm not telling you to, I'm just saying, if you happen to, they might actually say, oh, we want that replaced. That's a flag. 35 years old is definitely a flag for replacement.
And thoughts on rope or line standing rigging?
I love it. There's so many choices when it comes to ropes, running rigging, that talk to, you know, your local chandlery or talk to us, and we will match up the option of line to what your need is so that you get what you need out of the line. There's lots of options though.
And I'll just go to the last question as we're almost out of time. What grade of stainless do you use for your new rigging?
316.
Okay, I'll do one more. For ascending the mast, do you recommend mast steps, bosun's chair, or what?
Depends on your comfort level. The steps are handy, especially if you're going up by yourself, for sure. I don't use a bosun's chair just because I also do rock climbing. And when I'm out in the ocean and I'm climbing a mast while underway, I want the ability to end up turned upside down by accident and not fall out. But a climbing harness requires a skill in terms of being able to tie in. The benefit to a bosun's chair is that it's simple. It's usable by anybody. You don't have to have unique skills to be able to tie into it. You just clip it all together and in you get. So it just depends on your comfort level in terms of what you're doing and the application that you're doing. They all work.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, Diane Reid, and thank you for everyone joining us today. We are interested in your feedback on this seminar or topic ideas that you would like us to cover in the future. Simply click on the Evaluate tab located just above the seminar description on the virtual show and complete the form. And after the show, all attendees will receive a post-show survey. And be sure to check out all the features at the virtual Toronto Boat Show, including exhibitor, Tibbs Live, and the community section where you can have interactive discussions with other boaters. If you have questions, please check out the info booth, and we are here until Sunday, so have a great day at the Toronto Boat Show.
And if I can just add one more thing, if anybody had a question that didn't get answered, because I know there was one about lifelines and stuff like that, please just send an email to info@rigging. It'll get forwarded over to the rigging department. We'll be very happy to answer your questions. Thanks, guys and gals.
Great. Thanks.